Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 17 minutes before he learned the quiet new nurse kneeling at his feet was the most decorated special operations medic in naval history. St. Michael's Hospital in Houston hums with fluorescent lights and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Ashley Cooper has worked here for 3 weeks, moving through the ICU with methodical precision, her hand steady despite the slight limp in her left leg, a souvenir from a sniper round that never made it into any medical file. She reviews patient charts with unusual thoroughness, taking notes in a small leather journal, cross-referencing billing codes against procedure logs. The other nurses notice she arrives 40 minutes early and leaves 40 minutes late. She notices everything. Around her neck hangs a tarnished military challenge coin on a thin chain, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. She touches it absently when deep in thought, a gesture so automatic her conscious mind doesn't register it. The coin came from a firefight in Baghdad 3 years ago, pressed into her palm by a young Green Beret lieutenant with a shattered femur and blood soaking through his combat pants. That lieutenant's name was James Hawthorne. His son's name is Michael. Michael is currently stationed at Fort Bragg. Michael's commanding officer sent Michael's commanding officer to Houston to die, and Ashley was sent here to prevent exactly that. The ICU corridor stretches toward room 347. The tile floors click beneath her regulation shoes, leather soles, military grade, the kind that leave no scuff marks. In room 347, Colonel James Hawthorne lies sedated, his breathing controlled by a ventilator that wheezed its mechanical rhythm every 5 seconds. Multi-organ failure. Septic shock from a surgical site infection nobody caught in time. The paperwork says he was admitted 14 days ago. The real timeline is longer. His immune system has been deteriorating since before he arrived, which means the infection was already walking through his bloodstream when the ambulance brought him in, which means someone either missed it or never looked. Ashley's chart reviews have been methodical. She started with Hawthorne's hospitalization records. Then she started pulling charts on other ICU patients admitted during the same month. Then the month before. What she found was a pattern. 18 months of phantom consultant billings. Radiologist consultations on patients who never saw a radiologist. Pulmonology reviews for patients without lung complications. Cardiology evals billed to the hospital at $847 per consultation for ICU beds where the cardiologist's name appeared nowhere in the medical record. The pattern was clean, almost invisible, 1 false billing per week, never the same diagnosis twice, never the same consultant name twice. But Ashley had spent 14 years reading medical records from forward operating bases in Kandahar, where paper and internet were both unreliable and lives depended on knowing exactly what had been treated and what had been guessed at. She knew how to spot what wasn't there. Dr. Caldwell watches her from the nurse's station. He is 38, silver-haired in a way that photographs well, with a jawline that photographs better, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned by anyone who had leverage to make it stick. He wears a watch that costs more than most nurses' monthly mortgages. His suit is tailored. His voice sounds like authority because everyone has agreed it does. He had no idea that the quiet new nurse reviewing ICU billings had spent 6 years as an enlisted medic, 4 years at the Naval Postgraduate School studying field medicine and biostatistics, and 10 years as a Master Chief Petty Officer in Naval Special Warfare. He had no idea that her first assignment had been attaching surgical supplies to drones in Kandahar. He had no idea that Michael Hawthorne lived because Ashley Cooper had held his femoral artery closed with her bare hands while helicopter rotors screamed overhead, and that Michael's commanding officer, the man in room 347, had recognized her voice on the phone 1 week ago and sent word through channels that the woman he'd entrusted with his officer's life had to keep watch over him now. The staff meeting happens at 7 a.m. in the conference room on the ICU level. Caldwell stands at the head of the table, coffee in hand, his expression arranged into something that might pass for concern if nobody looked too closely. There are 17 people in the room, 2 hospitalists, 4 intensivists, 6 nursing supervisors, and 4 residents. Ashley sits in the back, her badge reading A. Cooper, RN, which is technically accurate and completely misleading. The ICU census is climbing, Caldwell says, scanning the room with the kind of attention politicians give cameras. And our staffing metrics are still showing gaps. We've brought in a new nurse, 3 weeks, yes, and I've been impressed with her work ethic. However, he pauses. Long enough for everyone to understand something harsh is coming. Dedication and hard work don't always translate to retention. People quit for reasons, and I'm betting this one will too. I'm betting 1 month's salary that she quits within a week. Anybody want to take that bet? Nobody does. Betting against the attending who controls your schedule is how you end up working nights and weekends for 3 months. Ashley doesn't react. Her hands remain folded on the table. Her face is an unreadable mask. The expression of someone who has sat through briefings where soldiers' lives were discussed in acronyms and she had been expected to keep her voice flat and her attention perfect. Around her neck, under her scrubs where nobody sees it, the challenge coin presses against her collarbone. The meeting continues. Caldwell talks about infection control metrics, about pressure ulcer prevention, about the new protocols from administration that everyone will need to integrate by Friday. Ashley takes notes. She writes dates, names, times, everything exact. The pen she uses is military issue, the kind that writes underwater. Around her, the other nurses exchange glances. They've seen Caldwell do this before. They know the new nurse just became his personal project. They know how this ends. But they don't know what Caldwell knows, either. He knows that his billing patterns are flagged somewhere in the hospital's auditing system. He knows that internal compliance sometimes hires consultants to review suspicious patterns. He knows that the quiet nurse with the limp and the weird medical knowledge has been spending her lunch breaks in the medical records office. He knows because he was trying to figure out if she was an auditor and decided to find out by breaking her, because broken people leave, and when they leave, they don't talk, because who wants to admit they were broken by someone with the power to write termination letters that follow you through every job application you'll ever submit? The cafeteria is on the first floor. Ashley stands in line at 11:16 a.m., holding a tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water, yogurt cup. The lunch crowd has thinned. She's planned the timing carefully. She's always planning. Caldwell appears at 11:49, coffee cup in one hand and the kind of expression on his face that suggests he's about to accomplish something. He doesn't bump into her. That would be too obvious for someone with his intelligence. Instead, he brushes past her left side, the side with the limp, at the exact moment she's shifting her weight, and his shoulder catches the tray at an angle that guarantees maximum dispersion. The turkey sandwich slides. The apple bounces. The water cup flips. Charts that Ashley had pulled from the ICU file room, tucked under the tray because she didn't trust leaving them at the nurse's station, scatter across the tile floor in a spreading pattern like a fan. They hit the wet floor with a soft slap. Other people's lunches. Coffee cups. The scattered papers. Oops, Caldwell says, and his voice is a knife sliding between ribs because it's gentle, almost apologetic, the kind of voice that makes witnesses reluctant to say they saw anything. Sweetheart, could you get that cleaned up? I'd do it myself, but I've got rounds. He's already moving, already walking away, already someone else's problem now. He calls back over his shoulder. Pick that up, sweetheart. Before someone slips. The cafeteria goes quiet. Not loudly quiet. Just quiet. The absence of noise the way you notice when a ventilator stops humming. A woman at the next table pretends to read a magazine. A man in maintenance colors looks suddenly interested in the ceiling tiles. The other nurses, there are always other nurses taking lunch at the same time, focus intently on their food. Ashley's jaw tightens. Almost imperceptibly. A thin line of muscles tensing for exactly 1 second. That's all. That's all anyone watching sees before her face settles back into the expression of someone made of concrete. Her hands don't tremble. Her breathing doesn't change. She doesn't whisper curses or swallow hard or blink back anything that might be shame or anger or the sensation of every eye in the cafeteria landing on her like a weight she has to carry alone. She kneels. That's the second thing she does. She kneels to gather the scattered papers without a word, without a request for help that nobody would provide anyway. She moves through the spill, collecting pages, stacking them, finding the apple under a table 3 feet away. The water spreads. Someone brings paper towels. She doesn't know who. She doesn't look up to find out. She keeps working. Her hands move with the same steady precision that had sutured a Green Beret's femoral artery in a helicopter loud enough to steal thought. The same hands that had held a tourniquet tight while the patient screamed and the rotor wash tried to shred everything at ground level. The cafeteria returns to noise gradually. People resume eating. Forks clink. Coffee cups sit back down on saucers. The moment passes. But something in the air has changed. Some invisible line has been drawn, and everyone knows it, and everyone knows that someone is standing on one side of it alone. By 1 p.m., Ashley has reviewed the rest of room 347's medical records. The file is in her locker now, copied by her own hands during a supply run nobody was paying attention to. Colonel James Hawthorne had been a Green Beret. Baghdad Tour, 2009 to 2011. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. He left the service with medical discharge papers and a pension that's probably keeping him alive right now because his wife died 4 years ago and his kids are scattered across 3 military bases with their own deployments. He came to St. Michael's 14 days ago with a surgical site infection that should have been caught in pre-op screenings. Nobody caught it. 20 days now he's been lying in the ICU, his organs failing one by one, his case being rotated through the entire staff because nobody wants to own a failure this visible. The hospital phone rings at 2 p.m. Ashley is hanging fluids on a secondary ICU patient when charge nurse Patricia taps her shoulder. Caldwell wants to see you in his office. Now. Nobody says now at hospitals unless something is about to happen. Ashley follows Patricia down the hallway. Her left leg doesn't limp noticeably. She's been adjusting her gait for 3 weeks, distributing the pain evenly so nobody notices she carries one side different from the other. She has no idea what's about to walk through those doors, but she has an excellent understanding of what walking through them means. Once you're in an attending physician's office with the door closed, the only witnesses are the walls and the file cabinet and the decisions already made about what you're worth. Caldwell is sitting behind his desk. He gestures to the chair across from him. Ashley sits. The office smells like leather and expensive aftershave. His diploma from Yale hangs on the wall. Below that, a picture of him at a conference, shaking the hand of someone with general stars. He doesn't speak immediately. He's calculating something, how hard to push, where the breaking point might be, whether this quiet nurse is about to cry. I've been hearing about you, he says finally. Good work in the ICU. Fast learner. But I'm concerned about your foundational knowledge. Your references from your last hospital, I had my assistant make some calls. One of them doesn't exist anymore. The hospital closed 7 years ago. Did you know that? Ashley's pulse doesn't change. She's trained for this. Different kind of operation, different kind of risk, but the fundamentals remain constant. Stay calm, stay quiet, let him talk. Let him explain what he knows and what he's guessing. Silence is information, and information is survival. So I'm wondering, Caldwell continues, standing now, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, where exactly you got your previous experience. And I'm wondering if maybe you're not really a fit for St. Michael's after all. This is a surgical hospital. Trauma focus. We need people with real credentials, real backgrounds. We need people who can handle pressure. I'm not sure you're that person. I think you might want to reconsider this position. Take the severance. Move on. Find something more suited to your actual capabilities. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when he turned back to face her and saw that she hadn't flinched. Hadn't looked away. Hadn't trembled or asked for mercy or done anything that indicated she'd heard a single word he said. The chart reviews began in the 3rd week, during the graveyard shifts when the ICU hummed with ventilators and the night staff moved like ghosts through dimly lit corridors. Ashley sat at the nursing station with a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago, patient files spread across the desk in methodical rows. Her eyes, trained across 18 years of classified operations to catch patterns others missed, traced billing codes, consultation timestamps, and authorization signatures with the precision of someone reading enemy communications. The hospital's computer system was less secure than a FOB perimeter. She moved through it like water. The pattern emerged on night 6. Dr. Caldwell had billed phantom consultations for ICU patients across 3 separate departments: cardiology, neurology, infectious disease, consultations that never appeared in any patient record, never showed physician notes, never happened. 18 months of them. She calculated the total silently, approximately $427,000 in fraudulent claims. The numbers themselves weren't what caught her attention. It was the precision. The timing. The way certain patients were flagged as complex cases requiring specialist review right before the phantom charges appeared. Caldwell wasn't sloppy. He was methodical. He was hunting for the ones who wouldn't question a bill, the elderly, the uninsured, the ones drowning in medical debt who'd already given up fighting. By the morning of day 9, someone had whispered to Caldwell that the new girl was pulling billing records. The staff meeting started at 0700 hours. 15 people in the conference room, fluorescent lights harsh against cream-colored walls, the room smelling of burned coffee and the antiseptic residue that clung to everything in a hospital. Ashley sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, her scrubs impeccably pressed despite the 12-hour overnight shift she'd just completed. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the table like a man who owned the building. His silver cufflinks caught the light, $2,000 cufflinks, the kind that announced old money and older connections. "I need to address something," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted. "We have a new nurse on the ICU rotation." "What's your name again, Cooper?" He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I'll be honest with all of you. I'm making a wager. I'll bet a month's salary, that's real money, people, that she quits within a week. Maybe 2 weeks if she's stubborn. She doesn't have the spine for real medicine." The room went soft with laughter. The kind of laughter that only happens when someone with institutional power has given permission for cruelty. Ashley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One muscle. That was all. Her hands remained steady in her lap without a tremor, and she kept her eyes on the empty notepad in front of her with the same focus she'd once kept on an AC-130 gunship providing close air support over Kandahar. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of discipline compressed into the space of a heartbeat. 2 days later, she was in the cafeteria organizing patient files over lunch, a habit that marked her as either obsessively dedicated or socially incompetent, depending on who was watching. Caldwell approached her table like a predator testing the perimeter of a pen. The cafeteria was loud enough with the ambient clatter of trays and voices that most conversations would be private. Not this one. "Still here, sweetheart." Caldwell's voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. Other tables nearby went quiet. People could sense blood in the water. "I'm impressed. Most nurses with your limited skill set realize faster when they're out of their depth." He was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like a man who needed everyone to know he had money. Before she could respond, his elbow found her tray. It wasn't an accident. Accidents look different. This looked like a man testing whether she'd react, whether she'd cry or snap back or give him something he could report to administration. The coffee spilled across the table in a brown cascade. Her charts scattered like wounded birds across the linoleum floor. "Oops," Caldwell said with mock concern, his voice carrying that particular performative tone of men who needed witnesses. "Better clean that up before someone slips. Wouldn't want a lawsuit on your conscience." He walked away without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing against tile. The cafeteria noise resumed. Not immediately. There was a 3-second pause where everyone watched to see what the new girl would do. Ashley knelt to gather the scattered papers without a word, her movements economical and methodical, her face an unreadable mask. A young resident whispered to a colleague nearby, "That's not right." The colleague looked away. That was the way institutions worked. The quiet ones got punished, and the comfortable ones pretended not to see. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the night shift. Ashley was at the nurse's station entering vitals for 3 separate patients, Colonel Hawthorne's among them, when Caldwell swept past. He didn't bump her this time. He reached across her organized stack of charts and swept them all to the floor with his forearm, papers exploding across the station like a detonation. The sound was sharp and deliberate. The acrylic of his watch face clicked against the desk edge. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for the 2 residents and 1 attending physician to hear. "Unless chart organization is also beyond your capabilities." He didn't wait. He never waited. He walked away knowing the power dynamic was sealed. He'd given an order, and she would obey it, and everyone would see her obey it. Ashley dropped to her knees without hesitation, gathering papers with mechanical efficiency. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from having done this 100 times before, not chart organization, but the art of being invisible. Of accepting humiliation. Of showing strength by not breaking. One resident made a note on his phone, probably documenting the incident for some future complaint. The attending physician, a woman named Dr. Reeves, looked directly at Caldwell as he walked away, and there was something cold in her expression that suggested she'd just learned something important about him. The papers were back in order within 2 minutes. Ashley stood, brushed lint from her scrub pants, and returned to the computer terminal as if nothing had happened. Her finger touched the challenge coin at her throat, the tarnished coin from Baghdad, the one made from shrapnel and aircraft wreckage that she kept hidden beneath her uniform. The coin was small enough to fit in a palm, worn smooth from 18 years of contact against her skin. It was the only piece of her real identity she carried into this hospital. It was Caldwell's insurance policy against getting too comfortable in a lie. That evening, at 18:47 hours, she heard Caldwell in the hallway near the attending physician's lounge telling an administrator about her. The walls in hospitals weren't thick. Sound traveled like rumors. "Cooper's not working out," Caldwell was saying. "Sloppy documentation, can't handle pressure. I'm documenting everything for her inevitable termination. 3 weeks, maximum. She'll be gone before the end of the month." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who terminated others before and planned to terminate many more. Ashley continued entering Colonel Hawthorne's vitals into the computer system without pause. Heart rate 106. Blood pressure 128/74. Oxygen saturation 94% on supplemental oxygen. All trending downward. All suggesting a man whose body was systematically failing. Her hand, moving across the keyboard, didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. But her fingers, the ones that had held tourniquets tight on arterial bleeds, that had compressed chest cavities and stitched wounds in tent hospitals under mortar fire, her fingers found the challenge coin beneath her collar and held it like an anchor. Caldwell was hunting her. And now she understood why. The phantom billing, the consultations that never happened, the money that disappeared into accounts no one questioned, it was sophisticated enough, clever enough, insulated enough that it should have been invisible. But she'd been trained by the United States Navy to find invisible things. She'd been trained to follow money trails like they were blood in water. And what she'd found in those billing records had drawn Caldwell's attention like a shark sensing disturbance in the current. The question wasn't whether he knew what she was looking for. The question was what he'd do to stop her from finding it. At 2,300 hours, she conducted her routine check on Colonel Hawthorne. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm, the ventilator hissing its oceanic breath. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd carried Michael out of a firefight with a shattered femur and 300 yards of enemy fire between him and safety. The man who had a testimony to give about a convoy ambush in Baghdad that had killed 3 soldiers, wounded 7 more, and opened questions that certain people clearly didn't want opened. She didn't touch his forehead or adjust his blanket in any tender way that might suggest emotional attachment. That would violate protocol. That would create documentation. Instead, she checked his monitors with clinical precision, EKG normal sinus rhythm at 102. Respiratory rate 18 on ventilator settings. Urine output adequate. Kidney function declining but stable. Labs from the afternoon showed mild elevation in liver enzymes, the kind of elevation that in a patient with multi-organ stress could signal the beginning of decompensation. She made a mental note and filed it away in the compartment of her mind where she kept operational details. The one trained in survival. The one that had survived for Bronze Stars and 2 Purple Hearts and 18 years of operations that didn't appear in any official record. The one that understood that Caldwell had started moving against her because she'd gotten too close to something, and Hawthorne's case, his deterioration, his restricted treatment protocols, his scheduled testimony, all of it connected like cartridge cases at a crime scene. The morning would bring the shift change. Caldwell would arrive, and the real test would begin. The shift change came at 11 p.m., and with it came the first signs that Colonel Hawthorne's body was surrendering. His urine output had dropped to barely 30 milliliters per hour, the kidneys failing in real time. Ashley read the lab values like a tactical report, potassium climbing past 5.8, creatinine spiking to 3.2, liver enzymes deteriorating across the board. Multi-organ failure wasn't a diagnosis. It was a countdown. She adjusted his foredrip, her hand steady as surgical steel, and noticed the slight yellowing at the edges of his eyes. Jaundice. His liver was shutting down. By midnight, his heart rhythm had begun to fragment. Not yet the catastrophic arrhythmia, but the warning tremors before an earthquake, occasional ectopic beats, the monitor registering irregular blips like a stuttering confession. Each aberration lasted 3, maybe 4 seconds before sinus rhythm returned. Each return felt like a reprieve that couldn't last. Ashley stood at the monitor station outside his room, watching the green line trace its increasingly unstable pattern across the screen. 1:07 a.m. The first cardiologist arrived, Dr. Reeves, the one who'd nodded to her in the cafeteria. He reviewed the chart for 45 seconds, glanced at Caldwell's notation, terminal case, comfort measures only, and turned away. No examination. No questions. He simply left. The next physician came at 1:23 a.m. Then another at 1:31. The hospital's night staff moved through room 347 like pilgrims passing a shrine they decided held no blessing. Ashley counted them silently as the hours dissolved. 2. 5. 8. Each doctor walked past the same doorway, saw the same chart, heard the same verdict from Caldwell's authority, and moved on to patients worth saving. By 1:50 a.m., she had counted 17. The medication room smelled like antiseptic and cold fluorescent hum when Caldwell closed the door behind her. His face held the expression of a man who'd been preparing this conversation for days, maybe longer. "I've been reviewing your employment file," he said, his voice carrying the texture of a knife being sharpened. "Called a few of your references. Interesting inconsistencies." He moved to the controlled substance cabinet, his movements deliberate, theatrical. "Your previous supervisor at Dallas Memorial? That hospital has no record of you working there. Your nursing school transcripts? Spotless. Too spotless. No failed exams, no remedial coursework, no academic advisories." He turned to face her, and his smile was the kind that came before the actual hurt arrived. "I've contacted the Texas Board of Nursing with concerns about credential fraud. I've also spoken to 4 hospital board members about your pattern of insubordination, chart tampering, and what I'm characterizing as deliberate interference with medical decision-making." Ashley's face remained a mask, jaw set, eyes focused on a point past his left shoulder, her breathing controlled. Her mind was already calculating, her cover's integrity was compromised. The mission timeline was collapsing. Hawthorne had perhaps 6 hours before organ failure became irreversible. "Here's what happens next," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to the tone a hunter uses when closing in on wounded prey. You resign tonight. Effective immediately. You walk out of here, and you disappear. Or I bring in Joint Commission investigators tomorrow, and I destroy whatever career you think you have in this state. Your choice, sweetheart. He said it like he'd already won. Like the outcome was inevitable. The alarm sounded at 1:58 a.m. Not the soft beeping of a monitor drift. Not the controlled escalation of a steady deterioration. The full code alarm, the shriek that meant the heart was dying. Ashley was already moving before the sound finished its first cycle, muscle memory overriding protocol. She knew the route to room 347 by tactile memory now, 17 steps from the medication room, left through the double doors, 15 feet down the corridor. Her feet moved on their own. Hawthorne's monitor showed ventricular tachycardia, the chaotic, useless quivering of a heart that was no longer pumping blood to the brain. His blood pressure had plummeted to 52/31. The oxygen saturation was dropping toward lethal numbers. The crash cart was positioned 3 feet from his doorway, the emergency equipment locked and ready. Ashley reached for the handle. Caldwell's hand appeared on the crash cart before hers did. I said no heroic measures, he stated. His voice was calm now, almost peaceful. The voice of someone who'd already decided the outcome. This patient dies on my orders. Touch that cart and I'll have security remove you. I'll have the Houston Police Department arrest you for assault. He was blocking the cart now, his body forming a barrier between her and Hawthorne's last chance at survival. Behind him, through the doorway, Ashley could see the monitor. Hawthorne's oxygen saturation was at 68% and falling. 65, 61. Each percentage point represented neural tissue dying, brain cells suffocating in real time. The ventricular tachycardia continued its violent, useless rhythm across the screen. Ashley stood frozen at the threshold. The choice crystallized in that moment with the clarity of a tactical decision point. Behind her, the intact mission, the preserved cover, the ability to walk out of this hospital in 3 days with her identity secure. Ahead, a colonel who'd carried her son out of a burning convoy, a man who'd volunteered to testify about soldiers who'd been murdered in that ambush, a patient who was about to die 50 feet from a crash cart because a man with a title had decided his life wasn't worth saving. 20 doctors had walked past. 20 physicians from 3 departments had reviewed the same patient, seen the same chart, accepted the same verdict, and moved on. The entire night medical staff of St. Michael's Hospital had voted with their silence. They decided Colonel James Hawthorne's life was acceptable loss. The monitor read 58% oxygen saturation. Ashley's hands remained at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a surgical laser. You're right, doctor, she said quietly. I can't touch that cart. She turned and walked 3 steps down the corridor, stopped at the crash cart positioned at the next patient's door, and without breaking stride, disconnected its magnetic alarm sensor and carried it back toward room 347. Caldwell's face went pale. He moved toward her, but Ashley had already entered the room, already opened the crash cart, already found the scalpel. The blade felt familiar in her hands. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Size 7.0 endotracheal tube. Direct access. The training from Kandahar field hospitals came back in sequence, muscle memory from operations that had never happened, at least not in any official record. Her left hand found the intercostal space, the 5th rib, the anatomical landmarks that hadn't changed in the 20 years she'd been doing this. The scalpel moved. The skin parted. The breastbone lay exposed, pale yellow beneath its thin covering of tissue. Behind her, Caldwell was screaming for security. The monitor still showed 52%. She opened the pericardium with 2 precise cuts. Hawthorne's heart lay motionless, a fist-sized failure that no medication could fix. She placed her hand inside his chest and began the direct cardiac massage, her fingers wrapped around the failing organ, compressing it against the vertebral column, forcing blood that didn't want to move toward a brain that was running out of time. 52% became 54 became 56. The rhythm was wrong, but the perfusion was happening. Her hand moved with the terrible fluid precision of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds determined whether a man lived or died. The next words out of Caldwell's mouth never came. Security was already moving toward her. The code team was responding. The moment had fractured into two separate realities, one where Ashley Cooper was a nurse about to lose everything, and one where the outcome was already being written by hands that refused to stop. The heart monitor's continuous scream filled room 347 at 2:03 a.m. One long, unbroken tone. Flat line. Colonel Hawthorne's chest had stopped moving. Caldwell was already turning away, his hand reaching for the door, his voice cutting through the ICU noise like a blade, his terminal. "Stand down." Ashley didn't hear the rest. She heard only the flat line and the command and the 20 doctors who had walked past this man's room over the last 6 hours accepting his death like a verdict from God. She shoved past Caldwell so hard his coffee sloshed across his white coat. "You're done," he called after her, but she was already moving. Security was being summoned. She could hear Caldwell's voice rising behind her, that practiced urgency of a man used to being obeyed. She had maybe 90 seconds. The crash cart was 3 feet away, its defibrillator pads and medications arranged like a surgeon's instruments in the pre-dawn darkness. She grabbed the scalpel with one hand and her betadine bottle with the other, her movements clean and decisive, the way a sniper checks her weapon before the shot. Room 347 was silent except for the monitor's death song. The nurses at the station watched her scrub in, their faces frozen in the particular horror of watching someone break every rule simultaneously. Her hands trembled for exactly 0.2 of a second, not from fear, but from the familiar pressure of entering kill or be killed space. In field hospitals in Kandahar, you recognized this moment. Time did something different. The world narrowed to the patient and the choice: follow protocol and watch him die, or burn your entire life to the ground on the chance he might live. Ashley made her decision at 2:04 a.m. She tore open Hawthorne's gown with her left hand and poured betadine across his chest with her right. The smell of iodine flooded the room, sharp and chemical, the smell of every operating tent she'd ever worked in when electricity was a memory and morphine was the only painkiller available. Someone gasped from the doorway. She heard Caldwell's voice, quieter now, almost conversational. "Yes, I need security in ICU immediately. And get me the chief medical officer. We have a nurse performing an authorized surgery." The scalpel was a whisper through skin. Between the ribs. Fourth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomy so automatic her hands found it without her mind. Muscle memory took over. She cracked his sternum open with her bare hands, spreading the ribs like a prayer, and reached inside. Hawthorne's heart was a stopped fist in her palm. For 11 minutes, Ashley performed direct cardiac massage. No equipment. No monitors. Just her hands inside a human chest, squeezing a colonel's heart manually, feeling the resistance of the muscle, the warmth of blood, the fragile architecture of a life that had survived IEDs and ambushes and Baghdad dust only to fail in a Houston hospital. The technique she was using, the pressure points, the rhythm, the way to avoid tearing the coronary arteries with brute force, none of it came from civilian nursing programs. These came from forward operating bases. From Kandahar. From 18 years of classified operations where the difference between life and death was your hands and your nerve and your willingness to break every rule that assumed you had backup. Sweat dripped down her forearms. Her breathing stayed controlled, clinical. The monitor continued flat line. 2 minutes. 4. 6. Someone was crying at the doorway. Someone else was repeating, she's insane, like a prayer or a curse. At 2:08 a.m., the monitor remained dark. At 2:10 a.m., Ashley felt something beneath her hands. A fluttering. A single contraction of muscle that shouldn't have happened. Then another. The monitor registered it as a whisper of activity. Not a rhythm. Not survival. Just a heart remembering, for one moment, how to beat. She maintained compression. 2 more minutes. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already watched the worst and refused to surrender to it. Pain was information. Her shoulders burned. Her forearms were slick with blood. The heart beneath her hands contracted again, weak but autonomous, a muscle remembering its job. At 2:14 a.m., the monitor showed rhythm. Irregular, fragile, barely there, but rhythm. A sinus heartbeat. Her hand still, just maintaining light compression, feeling for stability. The O2 sat climbed from 63 to 71 to 84. His pressure began rising from the undetectable into the realm of salvageable. By 2:20 a.m., Hawthorne's vitals had stabilized into something that looked like life instead of an elaborate goodbye. Ashley withdrew her hands with surgical care and closed the incision with rapid sutures. 10 stitches. Neat, precise, the kind that belonged in a surgical suite instead of an ICU at 2:21 a.m. Her breathing was controlled. Her voice, when she spoke to the nurses standing frozen in the doorway, was steady, continuous cardiac monitoring. EKG every 5 minutes. Get me the chief of surgery and notify the blood bank we may need type O negative standing by. Nobody moved. That's not a request, she said. They moved. Caldwell was waiting at the nurse's station when she emerged from room 347 at 2:24 a.m., and he was holding a folder the thickness of a patient's entire medical history. His face had shifted from anger into something more dangerous, calculation. He had already made calls. She could see it in the way he stood. For board members before dawn. His legal network mobilized. His narrative prepared. Practicing medicine without a license, he announced loudly enough that the night shift staff could hear. The words were formal, clinical, the kind of language that belongs in court filings. Reckless endangerment. Assault on a patient. Unauthorized surgery. He opened the folder with the ceremony of someone delivering a death sentence. I have already contacted for members of the hospital board and our legal team. I have also reached out to your previous employers and references. A pause, surgical. They tell an interesting story about gaps in your timeline. Deployments that don't match the standard narrative. Education credentials that don't quite add up. Ashley said nothing. The morning shift would be arriving in 3 hours. The sun would rise. The world would keep turning. She already knew what was coming. Joint Commission investigators will be arriving at 9 a.m., Caldwell continued, his voice like a scalpel through surgical gloves. They will review every action you took in that room. They will interview the staff. They will document that you acted against direct orders, that you performed procedures you are not licensed to perform, that you subjected a dying man to unnecessary trauma in his final hours. He smiled. The smile was the worst part. It was the smile of someone who had already won. Your career in Texas is finished, Master Cooper. Your license will be revoked. And if you make any desperate claims about classified missions or Black Ops assignments or military cover stories, you will only confirm what I've already suggested to these investigators, that you are mentally unstable. Delusional. A risk to patient safety. Security appeared from the elevator. 2 officers. Professional. They didn't look at her with judgment. They looked at her the way security looks at anybody, with the neutrality of people following orders. I'm sorry, one of them said quietly. His name tag read Martinez. He meant it. I know, Ashley said. She walked toward them with her hands visible, her composure intact, her face a mask without seams. 18 years of training meant you knew how to look like defeat even when your hand still felt the warmth of Hawthorne's chest and your mind was already calculating next moves. The morning shift was arriving. People were coming in for their 6 a.m. rounds. They watched her walk past in the company of security with the particular silence that means they understood what they were witnessing. Caldwell's last words followed her to the elevator. Reckless cowboy medicine ends careers, Ms. Cooper. It ends lives. You are done. The elevator doors closed. The light in the shaft climbed from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Ground floor. The lobby. The front entrance of St. Michael's Hospital, where the rain had stopped sometime after midnight and left the parking lot slick and reflecting the amber streetlights like oil on water. At 2:44 a.m., Ashley sat in her car in the parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, her mind doing what trained minds do after something shatters, cataloguing the damage, assessing survival probability, preparing for the next move. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the absolute knowledge that Hawthorne might still die. That she had broken her cover, destroyed her mission, burned 2 years of deep insertion for a man whose organ systems were still failing, whose survival was still measured in hours, whose testimony about the Baghdad ambush might never reach a courtroom. She reached into her pocket and found the tarnished challenge coin. Its twin was on Hawthorne's bedside table. The same phi base. The same year. The same phi fight where everything changed. She gripped it so tightly it cut her palm, drawing a thin line of blood across the calluses that 20 doctors would never ask about. The kind of scars that told the entire story to anyone trained to read them. 3 in the morning. The kind of dark that doesn't exist in cities anymore, only in parking lots on the interstate between nowhere and nothing. Ashley sat in a vinyl booth at a truck stop diner called Mel's, her coffee cold enough to form a skin across the surface, and stared at her reflection in the window. The woman looking back had hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, a mouth that hadn't smiled in 72 hours. 2 years of deep cover. 2 years of building this identity, this reputation, this fragile civilian scaffolding. All of it gone in 11 minutes of open cardiac massage and one security guard's hand on her elbow escorting her toward the exit while Caldwell's voice followed her down the corridor. Your reckless cowboy medicine will ensure you never work in Texas again. If you breathe a word about any of this, if you tell anyone what you really are, your protests will only confirm you're unstable. Unstable is all anyone will remember. She turned the coffee mug in circles. The fluorescent lights above hummed their electric song, and somewhere in the kitchen, a line cook was making eggs for a trucker who'd driven through the night. Nobody here knew her name. Nobody here would ever know what she'd done in that hospital room. She was just another tired woman in scrubs, a nurse who'd lost her job, a cautionary tale about someone who'd overstepped. The challenge coin sat heavy in her scrub pocket, pulled from her locker before security escorted her out, the only piece of evidence that this version of her had ever been real. She pressed her thumb against it through the fabric. Cold metal. Tarnished from Baghdad, from hands that had held something far more important than regulations. She'd been sent to protect Colonel Hawthorne. She'd done that. She'd done everything the mission required. And now she sat alone at 3 in the morning wondering if anyone would ever believe it had actually happened. The news broadcast didn't come from her phone. It came from the television mounted above the diner counter, where a waitress with tired eyes was refilling coffee cups and nodding at sports highlights. Ashley wasn't paying attention until she saw the blue dress uniform. Her dress uniform. Her service photo from 15 years ago, when she was just a second-class petty officer, before the promotions and the black ops and the surgeries that couldn't be explained in medical records. The news anchor's voice cut through the diner noise like a blade. Missing decorated combat medic Master Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, last seen on assignment in Germany, is now wanted for questioning in connection with an incident at Houston St. Michael's Hospital. The Navy has issued a. The volume faded as Ashley's entire body went perfectly still. Not because she was afraid. Because she understood exactly what had just happened. Caldwell had panicked. He'd called someone. Maybe a board member. Maybe a contact higher up the food chain. Someone who didn't know the difference between a missing combat medic and a nurse who'd saved a dying patient, and he'd reported her. Probably made it sound like a security breach. Probably suggested she was unstable, unhinged, dangerous. He'd tried to bury her by raising the alarm bells loud enough that someone answered. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd used her real name. She was still staring at the television when the hospital's lobby television caught fire with the same broadcast, and the veteran security guard who'd escorted her from the building 6 hours earlier, a man named Marcus with a scar along his jaw from a Navy career that had ended in a bar fight in San Diego, went rigid. His eyes locked on the service photo. The same photo from her military record. The same face he'd seen walking out of St. Michael's, shoulders square, head level, no tears, no trembling. Just a woman carrying her dignity in both hands like it was made of glass. Marcus's coffee cup stopped midway to his mouth. He set it down very carefully. His voice came out low enough that only the nearest orderlies and ER nurses could hear it, but it carried the weight of recognition earned through 2 decades of service. That's a Master Chief. Navy Special Warfare. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The room understood what that meant. The room understood that a Master Chief doesn't wash out of hospitals. A Master Chief gets assigned to them. Dr. Caldwell was standing near the pharmacy window when he heard it. His face experienced something very specific in that moment, not anger, not confusion, but the exact sensation of understanding that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. The color left his cheeks in stages, like someone pulling a white sheet off a painting. His jaw moved twice, like he was trying to form words that wouldn't materialize. He tried to remove her because she was too thorough. He tried to discredit her because she was too dangerous. He'd never considered that the reason she was so dangerous was because she had actually been trained by the United States military to be exactly that. 17 hospital staff watched his face drain from pink to gray to something approaching translucent. Nobody said anything. They didn't need to. 2 hours later, a 3-star general walked through those same hospital doors wearing dress blues that had been tailored by someone who understood the geometry of authority. Admiral James Hayes. 43 years of naval service. Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. The kind of man whose arrival changed the atmospheric pressure in a building the way a storm system changes the sky. He didn't ask questions. He had a folder 3 inches thick. Military records. Classified operations. Commendations. A dossier that made the hospital's chief medical officer look like he might need to sit down. The Admiral's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from knowing nobody would interrupt him, and he spoke directly to the hospital administrator. Master Chief Cooper was on assignment. She was protecting a witness. She completed her mission. Now I'd like to understand why your staff tried to prevent her from doing that. The administrator's response died before it began. Nobody there could compete with that kind of institutional gravity. But it was Colonel Hawthorne who provided the final confirmation. He was conscious now. Recovering. His skin had the color of someone who'd been pulled back from a very specific precipice, and when the Admiral asked him directly, "Colonel, do you know who saved your life?" Hawthorne's eyes found the doorway with the precision of a man who'd trained his entire life to remember faces. Master Chief Ashley Cooper. Baghdad. 2008, she took a round meant for me. Shielded me with her own body. His voice was steady. The kind of steady that only comes from absolute certainty. She never filed a report. Never claimed a Purple Heart. Just kept going. He reached toward the bedside table, where his personal effects had been kept in a plastic bag. His hand shook slightly as he extracted something small and tarnished, a challenge coin, the metal darkened by time and sand and the specific weight of history. The coin from the fight. The physical evidence of her sacrifice. This is from our unit. 2008, she carries the matching piece. Check her locker. You'll find it. They did check. The security footage would later show exactly what transpired when Caldwell understood the scope of his error. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. His face performed the specific expression of a man watching his entire institutional protection mechanism collapse in real time. Because he'd attacked a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer. He'd thrown charts at her. He'd publicly mocked her. He'd called board members to discredit her. He'd contacted investigators to remove her. He'd done all of this to a woman whose job was literally to operate in hostile environments and emerge intact. And he documented every single instance on hospital security cameras that were now being reviewed by people with federal badges. his medical school mentor, a surgeon named Dr. Patricia Venkatesh, who had mentored Caldwell for 20 years and vouched for his character to every institution he'd ever joined, saw the video at 5 in the afternoon. Caldwell throwing charts, his voice cutting like a blade. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His hand on a tray. Paper scattering across the nurse's station like confetti at a funeral. And in that video, the woman, the Master Chief, never flinched. Never responded. Never gave him the satisfaction of breaking her composure. Dr. Venkatesh watched that woman's face remain an unreadable mask while staff looked away in embarrassment, and something inside her crystallized into absolute clarity. She'd been wrong about Michael Caldwell. Catastrophically, publicly, irreversibly wrong. At 5:30 p.m., she released a statement to the Texas Medical Board. "I was wrong about Dr. Michael Caldwell. I have withdrawn my endorsement. I disavow his actions and accept full responsibility for my poor judgment in supporting his career." The statement was posted alongside the viral video, which by then had accumulated 2 million views. Each view was another person understanding that a man with institutional power had tried to destroy someone he perceived as weak, and had attacked a decorated war hero in the process. The hospital board convened an emergency review at 6:30 p.m. By 7, they'd pulled 18 months of billing records. By 8, they'd found the pattern. Phantom consultations. Services billed but never rendered. Medications charged to patients who'd never received them. Exactly $342,000 in fraudulent charges, documented in the precise manner that Ashley had been quietly investigating for the entire duration of her assignment. The pattern was so clear, so methodical, that there was no room for error or misinterpretation. Caldwell had been systematically defrauding the hospital, the insurance companies, and the patients themselves. And he'd tried to remove the one person who was close to discovering the full scope of his operation. His frantic explanations began at 9 p.m., when his attorney arrived and advised him to shut up. But Caldwell couldn't shut up. His voice shook as he tried to construct a narrative that made sense. "I didn't know who she was. Her credentials had inconsistencies. I was protecting patient safety. I made an error in judgment, but I didn't know she was." His words collapsed against the evidence. Investigators had found the emails. The ones where he discussed Ashley with board members, noting her suspicious thoroughness with chart documentation and her unusual interest in billing patterns. He'd known something was wrong with his operation. He just hadn't known it was a Master Chief Petty Officer who was documenting it. By 3 a.m. the next morning, the Texas Medical Board had opened a formal investigation. By noon, the State Attorney General's office was reviewing criminal fraud charges. By the end of the week, Caldwell's medical license had been suspended pending review. His attorney negotiated a plea deal within 30 days, restitution of the fraudulent charges, 5 years probation, surrender of his medical license, and a permanent ban from practicing medicine in any state. His wife filed for divorce 2 weeks later. His network of board members and hospital administrators who'd taken his calls began receiving ethics investigations of their own. 2 resigned immediately. 1 faced prosecution for accepting kickbacks routed through consulting companies that didn't exist. Another was terminated and referred to the FBI for investigation into whether the billing fraud had been sanctioned at an institutional level. The dominoes fell in sequence, each one triggering the next, the entire structure that Caldwell had built collapsing like a house constructed from playing cards. The man who'd commanded 3 departments, who'd thrown charts at nurses, who'd called in favors from board members and investigators, who'd tried to destroy someone he perceived as weak, that man was left with nothing. No license. No career. No credibility. No allies who'd admit to knowing him. 6 months later, Ashley stood in dress blues at the Pentagon. Full Master Chief Petty Officer uniform, the rank insignia gleaming on her shoulders. Beside her stood Colonel James Hawthorne, recovered completely, his colors bright, his bearing restored. The commendation ceremony was taking place in a room with brass fixtures and windows overlooking Arlington. Hawthorne had provided his testimony about the Baghdad convoy ambush. That testimony had led to 3 arrests and comprehensive reforms in contractor oversight. Lives had been saved because he'd lived long enough to tell the truth. And Ashley had been recognized with a commendation for mission completion under hostile conditions, the kind of recognition that goes into classified files and doesn't appear in newspapers, but carries weight in corridors where people understand what those decorations actually mean. In the front row, her son Michael sat in navy dress whites, his shoulder still healing from the injury that had started this entire operation. When the ceremony concluded and the 3-star general motioned for the officers to at ease, Michael stood, and his hand moved to his forehead in a salute that would have made a drill instructor weep. His eyes were bright. His jaw was steady. His mother, the woman who'd sacrificed her name, her career, her civilian identity to keep his commanding officer alive long enough to testify, stood in dress blues with 2 Navy crosses on her chest, and he saluted her with the respect of a son to the warrior who'd shaped him. Across the room, Dr. Caldwell sat in a community college classroom in suburban Houston, demonstrating CPR compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie. The class was called Basics of Cardiopulmonary Resuscitation. His hands moved through the motions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 compressions, then breaths into the dummy's plastic mouth. His voice was thin as he counted aloud. The students didn't know who he was. They didn't care that his hand shook slightly as he completed each cycle. They saw only a man teaching a minimum wage job, which was all he would ever be again. After the Pentagon ceremony, as the officers were beginning to disperse, a young Navy corpsman approached Ashley with the kind of nervous energy that comes from meeting someone you've heard about only in whispered stories. "Master Chief, I heard what you did in that hospital. How did you know to keep going when everyone said to quit?" Ashley's hand moved to the challenge coin at her throat, the tarnished piece of metal that had been darkened in Baghdad and carried through 2 years of undercover work. Her eye shifted briefly to Colonel Hawthorne, then back to the corpsman. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen the absolute worst and chose to help anyway. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The corpsman nodded, understanding settling across his face like dawn. And Ashley turned back to her son, who wrapped her in a fierce embrace that lasted long enough to mean something real. The mission was complete. The soldier was saved. The woman who'd been told to pick up charts from the floor stood in full dress uniform with ribbons across her chest that documented 18 years of courage in places the public would never know about. And everyone in that room, everyone who understood the language of service and sacrifice, knew exactly what those decorations meant. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.